Hello, and welcome to the Forest Disease Ecology and Management Module, Part 2. This module was created by Dave Shaw, OSU Extension Forest Disease Specialist. My name is Bob Parker, and I will be your narrator for this module. In Part 2, we will first discuss parasitic plants, then give detailed examples of the many types of disease organisms we've discussed, such as root rots and stains, trunk rot, foliage diseases, cankers and rust and mistletoe, and we'll examine the management tools you can use to keep your woodlands healthy. Parasitic plants such as mistletoe are among the most damaging disease organisms Oregon woodland owners contend with, both in terms of tree wood growth and economic loss. Mistletoes cannot produce their own food, so they depend on a host to survive. Trees infected with mistletoe have reduced tree growth and wood quality, and severe infections can result in attack by other pests due to the stress condition of the tree. There are dwarf mistletoes like the ponderosa pine mistletoe, and there are the much larger leafy mistletoes that occur on Oregon white oak, for example. There are 4 main species of dwarf mistletoes in Oregon: Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe, hemlock dwarf mistletoe, pine dwarf mistletoe, and the larch dwarf mistletoe. As you can see in this photo of an infected Douglas fir branch, the mistletoe plants are smaller than the tree needles, hence the dwarf identification. The dwarf mistletoes are specialized parasitic plants that occur on conifers in the pine family. They have scale-like leaves and small perennial shoots that can often be hard to see even from a short distance away. Their seeds are distributed through an explosive discharge which can hurl them as much as 30 feet or more. The mistletoe plants high up in the overstory rain their seeds down on the smaller surrounding trees and infecting them, thus perpetuating the presence of the disease in the stand. Dwarf mistletoe has a profound influence on many aspects of a forest. Over time, mistletoe may cause trees to form large brooms, as shown here. On the plus side, the brooms make excellent roosting and nesting platforms for birds, and birds and porcupines will eat the mistletoe stems and seeds. But the brooms can also increase susceptibility to wildfire and cause the crown above the brooms to die back. Mistletoe disrupts the water balance in the tree because the tree will provide a disproportionate amount of resources to an infected area, resulting in reduced growth or even dieback in other parts of the crown. Mistletoe causes a substantial reduction in tree growth, and although it's a relatively slow-acting pathogen, it does also result in mortality. The forest ecology can change over time as susceptible tree species die out and are replaced with other species. The effect on tree growth can be dramatic, as shown here. At a high infection rate, basal area growth declined by almost 30%. The western hemlock dwarf mistletoe infects, of course, western hemlock, and also Pacific silver fir. In this photo, you can see the short aerial shoots as well as the berries. The good news is that it is possible to manage mistletoe disease, but you will need to focus on finding the right tree for the right site. Selecting alternative species that are not susceptible to mistletoe, or emphasizing a mixed species managed approach that includes non-susceptible species, can be very important strategies. As an example, if you have an infected Douglas fir overstory, plant ponderosa pine, which is not affected by the Doug fir mistletoe. Silviculture is the key. Leafy mistletoes are much different from the dwarf species and are actually a well-developed shrub. They also produce berries, but rather than shooting out the seeds like the dwarf mistletoe plants do, the berries are eaten by birds, which then distribute the seeds widely. There are 3 types of the leafy or true mistletoes, and all are members of the Phoradendron genus. In Oregon, we have the oak mistletoe, juniper mistletoe, and the incense cedar mistletoe. The leafy mistletoes are not as harmful as the dwarfs because they have stronger photosynthetic capacity, and they are a popular decoration during the Christmas season. That wraps up our overview of forest disease organisms, And now we'll go into more detailed discussions of these diseases and management tools you can utilize to minimize their impacts. The first disease in our list is laminated root rot, which is caused by Phylinus wirii, and is the most important root disease in Western Oregon. Laminated root rot destroys the root systems, and without that structural support, trees become very susceptible to wind throw. The trees most affected by laminated root rot are Douglas fir, grand fir, and mountain hemlock. The fungus is so effective at decaying roots that it creates a root ball, and the trees look like the roots have been gnawed off by a giant rodent. This laminated appearance shown here is one of the distinct laminated decay characteristics. The disease spreads by moving across root contacts and grafts, killing the bark. The next bad boy is the armillaria root disease, which is caused by the fungus Armillaria ostoyi. And although it does produce the well-known and very tasty edible honey mushroom, it is the most common root disease in Oregon, causing extensive economic loss. Armillaria affects all conifers and hardwoods to some degree, and is particularly damaged to trees that are already under stress from other causes. Trees infected with armillaria root disease often have resin flowing at the base of the tree, but with no visible wound. Armillaria colonizes the tree and kills the inner bark. If you peel back the bark and find a fungal or mycelial fan, that's pretty good evidence the tree is infected with armillaria. You may be already familiar with Ganoderma root and bud rot, which also goes by the name the artist conch. Its smooth white bottom surface is a popular medium for artists. The conch forms large, relatively thin structures on the trunks of infected trees, making it readily identifiable. Ganoderma is common on conifer trees, but is not particularly damaging compared to Phylinus or armillaria. It is, however, damaging to hardwood trees, such as bigleaf maple, red alder, Oregon myrtle, and Oregon white oak. The Port Orford cedar root disease is caused by the fungus Phytophthora lateralis, and, like many introduced diseases, it is devastating to susceptible hosts, such as the Port Orford cedar. It also kills Lawson cypress. The disease is transported by water, so if it gets into the streams, it will travel a long ways quickly. It is also transported within soil water and in mud, so equipment working in an affected area can take the disease to other work sites. The Port Orford cedar disease works by killing the inner bark of the tree. A distinguishing characteristic is a cinnamon color under the bark, which is normally rather light colored. The Port Orford cedar disease is managed by protecting the watershed, which is accomplished through road closures, roadside control of Port Orford cedar reproduction, thoroughly washing and cleaning equipment, growing tree stock that is genetically resistant, or planting new horticultural varieties. For more information about the disease, the United States Forest Service has a coordinator stationed in Central Point at the Forest Health Protection Office. Black-stained root disease is caused by the fungus Leptographium wagnerii, which colonizes the water-conducting tissues of their host roots, root collars, and lower stems, which results in the blockage of water movement to the foliage. In Oregon, it's most common in the southwestern and east-central parts of the state. The fungus is introduced to the host primarily by root-feeding beetles of the Hylaces genus. There are two types of black-stained fungus. There's the Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. Infection centers are most common where there has been substantial tree damage or site disturbance from harvesting, and areas that have been pre-commercially thinned. And here are some examples of the bark beetle and weevil insect vectors responsible for blackstain. Blackstain can cause a flow of resin from the bark of the infected tree and a black stain of the wood, but only for 1 or 2 rings. This photo shows a black stain mortality center located in the Rogue River National Forest. To minimize black stain problems, avoid wounding the trees, and, if thinning or pruning in your stand, delay those activities until after July in order to avoid the insect flies which spread the disease. And long term, you could consider favoring resistant tree species. The paint fungus, Echinodontium tinctorium, in addition to a serious disease problem, is noteworthy for having a really long name, and its conchs were actually used by Native Americans to make a reddish color paint. Its primary hosts are grand fir and western hemlock, where it caused a rusty red string rot, and as you can see in this photo, it causes very extensive heart rot. Logs like these are affectionately referred to as wood culverts. Another stem rot that produces conchs is Phalaenus pinei, which is also called white speck, red ring rot, or just pinei. Phalaenus infects Douglas fir and most other conifers. Brown crumbly rot is caused by Fomitopsis pinicola, or also called the red belt fungus, from the reddish belt around the outside of the conch. This rot occurs exclusively on dead trees, and so is not a disease problem for your live trees. Now we'll turn our attention from rots to needle diseases. In more recent times, a major Douglas fir needle disease in the coastal zone is the Swiss needlecast. Trees infected with the Swiss needlecast typically have poor foliage retention, and the needles are chlorotic or yellowish in color. It only infects Douglas fir, and is the most economically important foliage disease in the Pacific Northwest. Swiss needlecast is currently epidemic along the Oregon and Washington coasts, where large areas of spruce and hemlock forests were converted to Douglas fir plantations. It is a new phenomenon and was regarded as not important before the 1990s, when it was previously referred to as the Christmas tree disease. Outside of the coastal area, it tends to flare up in wet microsites and off-site plantings, and where the late spring and early summer times of the year are wet in consecutive years. Swiss needlecast has small black spore-producing bodies that emerge from the stomates on the underside of the needles. The disease damages trees by plugging up the stomates, or air pores, which causes starvation of carbon. The hyphae of Swiss needlecast grow inside the needles, but without causing cell death. As mentioned earlier, Swiss needlecast is a very damaging agent. Foliage retention is extremely important for good growth rates, and the foliage loss due to the disease results in poor growth losses of 50% or more, as evidenced in this photo. In addition to overall growth losses, it also leads to increases in the proportion of late wood, or the dark-colored rings, which influences wood density and structural strength properties. As you can see in this photo, the Douglas fir plantation has been severely damaged by Swiss needlecast, whereas the nearby spruce and hemlock mix stand is not affected at all. This map, created in 2015 through aerial surveys of the disease, indicated 589,000 acres were infected in Oregon. The red areas are severely infected, and the yellow areas are moderate. From 1996 through 2015, we experienced a four-fold increase, and the extent of the infection is spreading southwards into Northern California. While not as extensive or perhaps as economically important as the diseases we've discussed so far, many other of our tree species have noteworthy disease problems. Pacific madrone often has substantial foliage disease problems, such as the madrone foliage blight shown in this photo. Madrone trees also suffer from the madrone canker. The canker is associated with wounding and with pruning. Now let's talk about root disease. Root disease is difficult to manage because the pathogens tend to stay resident in the soil for a long time, but there are management steps to help minimize disease problems. It's always a good idea, of course, to maintain good vigor in your stands, as vigorous trees are much more able to resist insect and disease attacks, or if attacked, have a higher probability of survival. You can also thin the stand to decrease the potential for roots coming in contact with the disease. When harvesting, plan the logging well in order to prevent soil compaction and wounding of live trees, which can make them susceptible to infection. And when regenerating a site with planted seedlings, be careful not to plant susceptible species next to infected stumps. Other options for managing root disease include salvage harvesting, which is removing dead and dying trees to salvage their economic value, or sanitation cuts, which have the specific objective of removing diseased trees and ameliorating site issues. However, if improving wildlife habitat is one of your objectives, then retaining some dead and dying trees can help provide habitat for cavity nesting species. You can also shift to alternative tree species that are resistant to the disease, such as pine and cedar or red alder or other hardwoods. It's also a good idea to isolate the infection area with a 50-foot buffer. To summarize root disease management, it's important to bear in mind that there's no cure for root disease. You can only minimize its impact through careful preventative management. The first defense is to thin stands to maintain a high degree of tree vigor, and favoring for retention and planting less susceptible or immune trees that will help prevent the disease from spreading further. Moving on up the tree, here are some stem decay management tools to use. As always, be sure to do everything you can to encourage tree vigor. And when harvesting or performing other activities, avoid wounding trees, especially species like true firs and hemlocks, which give access to fungal spores or activate infections that may be present but dormant. Use proper pruning techniques that avoid creating excessive wounding, and, where possible, favor decay-resistant tree species. In order to minimize problems from foliage diseases, always select the right tree for the right spot, or in other words, make sure that the trees you favor for retention or seedlings you plant are well adapted for the conditions of that particular site. Planting seedlings not suitable for a particular site is a too common problem that can lead to disappointing results. Thinning and pruning to keep stands open and not overly dense helps promote airflow that keeps conditions drier and less conducive to foliage diseases. Also, avoid high hazard or high moisture sites such as those close to water, north-facing slopes, and above 3,000 feet elevation. And fertilizing a stand can help promote growth, but over-fertilization can damage roots, leading to tree stress and an elevated susceptibility to foliage disease. Canker-causing fungi are essentially always present, so to minimize canker problems, the same general management principles apply here as well. Maintain good tree vigor through proper spacing, and selecting the best trees, and plant seedlings that are well adapted to the site you're considering. And always avoid wounding trees, which increases susceptibility to disease. And the same principles apply for rust disease management. Plant the right tree in the right site, and avoid high hazard sites such as humid air pockets. White pine blister rust is a bit of a special case, and we will examine that next. We discussed the white pine blister rust in part 1 of this module, but for review, it is another introduced disease which was acquired when western white pine trees were sent to Europe, and then some years later, stock was returned to the U.S. carrying rust unknown to North America. The rust kills the 5-needle pines, such as western white pine, sugar pine, and whitebark pine. It uses alternative hosts, such as the ribes species. The blister rust disease can be controlled at least somewhat by pruning lower branches to increase airflow and reduce the humidity. The best insurance, however, is to plant with trees that have been bred for genetic resistance to the rust. Rust hazard zones identify areas according to temperature and humidity conditions, so you can use that information to avoid the cooler, moister areas that are more conducive to blister rust infections. Controlling dwarf mistletoes can be a bit tricky because treatments that directly attack the mistletoe, such as herbicides, will obviously attack the host as well. So the only known direct controls for dwarf mistletoe is to prune off infected branches or simply kill the entire tree. The good news is that dwarf mistletoes tend to be species-specific, so if your site will support other tree species, you can manage for trees that are not susceptible. For example, if you have ponderosa pine that is infested, you may be able to plant Douglas fir underneath the pine, since the fir cannot be infected by the pine mistletoe. While mistletoe can severely reduce tree growth and even cause mortality, it takes a high level of infection for that to happen. It takes a long time for dwarf mistletoe to build up, so there's no hurry to cut trees from that perspective. However, if you have regeneration of the same tree species underneath the infected trees, it won't take long for them to become infected, so those situations require prompt action. Oak mistletoe, like the dwarf mistletoes, can really only be controlled by pruning infected branches. And while removing the heavily infected trees reduces the rate of seed spread, birds consume the seeds, it can move them a long distance quickly. And if you're worried about the mistletoe plants on the branches that have been pruned off, don't be. The plants die after pruning and are no longer a threat. That completes our review of forest diseases in Oregon. Here are some take-home messages. There are a whole lot of forest pests out there that can kill your trees. And there are many pests which, although they can cause spectacular symptoms, seldom actually kill your trees. As a woodland manager, it's important for you to learn how to identify forest pests and know how to use preventative management techniques so disease doesn't become a serious problem on your property. If you would like to learn more about forest disease management, here are some recommended sources of information. Thanks for watching this forestry education module. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and found the information useful.